A dowager duchess does not scream when she is angry. She simply lowers her voice until the air in the room freezes. When Margaret Cavendish first laid eyes on the penniless, dirt-smudged woman her son intended to marry, she did not throw a fit. She poured a cup of tea, handed it to the girl, and silently vowed to destroy her. What Margaret didn't know was that the girl's late father was a ghost from her own past, and destroying the bride meant destroying herself. The carriage wheels ground against the white gravel of the driveway, a sound like teeth chewing on stone. Inside the velvet-lined cabin, Abigail Foster kept her hands folded tightly in her lap. She was 24 years old, accustomed to the smell of boiling glue, cheap ink, and damp London fog. She was not accustomed to sweeping vistas of manicured lawns, nor the looming monolithic limestone facade of Rothmere Abbey. The estate looked less like a home, and more like a fortress designed to keep the world out. And right now, Abigail was the world. Beside her, Henry shifted. He reached out, his warm, bare hand covering her chilled, gloved ones. "You are trembling," he noted. His voice was low, carrying the innate, casual authority of a man who had never been told no by anyone other than his mother. "It is November, Henry. It is cold." Abigail lied. "My mother is a pragmatic woman," Henry said, offering a smile that was meant to be reassuring, but only highlighted his sheer ignorance of the situation. "She values loyalty and honesty. Just be yourself." Abigail looked out the window. Men like Henry, raised in palaces with titles attached to their Christian names, believed that being oneself was a universal privilege. They did not understand that for people like Abigail, survival often meant being exactly what the room required you to be. And the room she was about to walk into required her to be a duchess. She felt entirely unequipped for the task. Her wool dress was neatly pressed, but it was 3 years old, turned at the seams to hide the wear. Her boots were sturdy, practical leather, not the delicate silk slippers worn by the women who usually graced these halls. The carriage halted. A footman opened the door before the vehicle had even fully settled. Henry stepped out first, offering his hand. Abigail took it, stepping onto the immaculate gravel. They were met in the great hall by silence. The ceiling vaulted upward into shadows, supported by marble columns that felt cold enough to absorb the heat from a human body. Footsteps echoed in the cavernous space. An elderly butler relieved them of their coats with a practiced, wordless efficiency. "The Dowager Duchess is in the morning room, Your Grace," the butler murmured to Henry, though his pale eyes briefly flicked toward Abigail, registering the mended hem of her skirt in a fraction of a second. Henry took Abigail's arm. They walked down a corridor lined with oil portraits of dead men who all shared Henry's sharp jawline and arrogant brow. Abigail kept her chin level. Her late father, William, had taught her many things in the cramped room above their bookbindery. One of them was how to walk into a room of rich men. "They have money, Abby," he would say, his hands stained with leather dye. "They do not have a monopoly on dignity. You carry your own." The morning room doors opened. The air inside was stiflingly warm, thick with the scent of forced hothouse lilies and burning beeswax. Margaret Cavendish, the Dowager Duchess of Rothmere, sat by the window. She was not a large woman, but she possessed a gravitational pull that commanded the space entirely. She wore severe black silk, entirely unadorned save for a single strand of heavy, luminescent pearls at her throat. Her silver hair was pinned with military precision. She did not look up from her embroidery when they entered. "Mother," Henry said, his voice subtly tightening. Margaret drove the needle through the linen fabric, drew the silk thread taut, and finally raised her eyes. They were the color of slate. She looked at Henry first, her expression softening into a facsimile of maternal warmth. Then her gaze shifted to Abigail. The warmth vanished, replaced by an assessment so clinical and swift it felt like a physical blow. Margaret took in the cheap wool, the calloused knuckles, the absence of a chaperone, the plain, unpowdered face. In 3 seconds, Abigail was weighed, measured, and discarded. "Henry," Margaret said. Her voice was like crystal, beautiful, clear, and fragile enough to draw blood if broken. "You did not send word that you were bringing a charity case." Henry's jaw clenched. "Mother, this is Abigail Foster, my fiancée." The silence that followed was absolute. A log popped in the fireplace, a sharp crack like a pistol shot. Margaret calmly set her embroidery hoop onto the table beside her. She smoothed the skirt of her gown. She did not raise her voice. She did not gasp. "Miss Foster," Margaret said smoothly. "How industrious of you. Please sit. Tea is cooling." Abigail moved to the nearest armchair, refusing to let her hands shake. She sat on the edge of the cushions, keeping her back straight. "I assure you, Your Grace, I am not a charity case," Abigail said. Her voice was steady, betraying none of the nausea twisting in her stomach. "I am quite capable of supporting myself." Margaret poured a cup of tea. She did not ask how Abigail took it. She simply slid the saucer across the mahogany table. "Is that so? Tell me, Miss Foster, what is it you do to support yourself? Are you a seamstress? A governess?" "No, your hands are too rough for a governess." "Mother," Henry warned. "I worked in a bookbindery, Your Grace," Abigail said, looking directly into Margaret's slate eyes. "My father was a master binder. I learned the trade from him." Margaret paused, her teacup halfway to her lips. A faint, almost imperceptible sneer touched the corner of her mouth. "A tradesman's daughter. How terribly modern of you, Henry. You have always had a penchant for collecting strays." "I love her," Henry stated flatly. "And we are to be married next month. I brought her here so that you might know the woman who will take over the running of this estate." Margaret took a slow sip of her tea. She set the cup down precisely in the center of the saucer. "Take over the running of the estate," she repeated. The words sounded absurd in her mouth. "Miss Foster, do you know how many tenant farms rely on the Rothmere estate for their survival?" "No, Your Grace," Abigail admitted. 64, Margaret said. "Do you know the annual operating cost of the Abbey alone?" "I do not." £12,000. Margaret continued, her voice gaining a quiet, rhythmic momentum. "Do you know the political alliances required to maintain our standing in the House of Lords? Do you know the protocol for seating a visiting duke versus a foreign prince at a dinner table? Do you know how to manage a staff of 80 people without inciting a riot over wage disputes?" Abigail swallowed hard. "I know how to manage accounts. I know how to balance a ledger. The rest can be learned." "This is not a trade school, Miss Foster," Margaret said softly. "This is a dukedom. It is not something one learns on a whim because my son was charmed by your gritty working-class resilience. It is an inheritance of blood, duty, and sacrifice." "I am aware of duty," Abigail replied, her tone hardening. "Are you?" Margaret's eyes narrowed. "Then do your duty to the man you claim to love, and leave him be. You will ruin him. That is enough." Henry stood up, his tall frame blocking the light from the window. "We will be shown to our rooms. Abigail will rest before dinner. If you cannot speak to her with respect, Mother, you will not speak to her at all." Margaret looked up at her son. She did not look angry. She looked deeply, profoundly exhausted. "As you wish, Henry. We shall see you at 8. Dress is formal." She knew, and Abigail knew, that Abigail did not own a formal dress. The dining room was 70 feet long. The walls were lined with dark oak paneling and heavy tapestries depicting violent hunting scenes. A crystal chandelier, dripping with hundreds of wax candles, hung low over a mahogany table that could comfortably seat 40 people. That evening, it seated 3. Margaret sat at the head of the table. Henry sat to her right, and Abigail to her left. The physical distance between them was immense. Abigail felt she had to raise her voice just to be heard over the clinking of silver and the soft footsteps of the footmen circling the room. Abigail wore her best dress. It was a dark blue cotton, simple and unadorned. Next to Margaret, who was draped in midnight blue velvet and diamonds, Abigail felt exactly as Margaret intended her to feel, like a servant who had accidentally wandered into the dining room and sat down. The first course was a clear soup. Abigail stared at the vast array of silverware flanking her plate. Her father had taught her manners, but their table at home had possessed one knife, one fork, and one spoon per person. Here, there were 3 of each, intricately engraved with the Rothmere crest. She watched Margaret from the corner of her eye, waiting to see which spoon the dowager used. Margaret, noticing the hesitation, picked up a spoon, held it for a moment, and then deliberately set it back down, choosing another. It was a tiny, calculated cruelty, designed to maximize Abigail's uncertainty. Abigail ignored the bait, picked up the outermost spoon, and ate in silence. "Tell me, Miss Foster," Margaret said, her voice echoing down the length of the table. "Where did your family originate? The Fosters of—" "Just London, Your Grace," Abigail replied. "Cheapside, mostly." A footman paused slightly as he poured wine into Henry's glass, his professional composure cracking for a fraction of a second at the mention of Cheapside. Margaret smiled. It was a terrible, predatory thing. "Cheapside? How colourful. I imagine you have seen a great deal of the realities of life. I have seen people work until their bones ache just to buy bread," Abigail said evenly. "Yes, I would call that reality." Henry leaned forward. "Abigail's father was a highly respected craftsman, Mother. He bound books for the Royal Society." "A craftsman?" Margaret mused, cutting a sliver of roasted pheasant. "How noble. Tell me, Miss Foster, did this craftsman teach you anything of art, of history, or was his tutelage strictly confined to the odours of the tannery? My father taught me that a book's true value lies in its pages, not its cover." Abigail shot back, her pulse pounding in her ears. "A lesson I find increasingly relevant today." Margaret stopped chewing. She dabbed her mouth with a linen napkin. For a moment, she looked genuinely amused. "A sharp tongue. The lower classes so often mistake rudeness for wit. It is a defense mechanism, I suppose, against the harshness of your environment." "Mother, stop!" Henry snapped, his patience fraying. "You are being deliberately hostile." "I am making conversation, Henry," Margaret said mildly. "I am trying to understand the woman you intend to install in my home. She is a stranger. She knows nothing of our ways. She does not know how to dress, how to speak to servants, or how to hold a wine glass." Margaret gestured gracefully toward Abigail's hand, which was gripping the stem of her glass a bit too tightly. "She is a lamb wandering into a slaughterhouse, and you are holding the gate open for her. Society will tear her to shreds, Henry. The ladies of the Tun will smile at her, while they gut her reputation. And you will be too busy in the House of Lords to protect her." Henry's face flushed dark red. "Society will accept her because she is my wife. Society will tolerate her to your face and laugh at you behind your back," Margaret corrected sharply. Her voice finally lost its icy calm, revealing the jagged edge of real panic beneath. "You think your title is a shield? It is a target? Your father nearly lost this estate to his own foolishness. I spent 30 years, Henry, rebuilding our reputation, securing our finances, groveling to bankers, and smiling at peers I despised, just so you would have something to inherit. And you would throw it away on a romantic whim?" Margaret turned her piercing gaze back to Abigail. "You think this is a fairy tale, Miss Foster. You think love conquers all. It does not. Love is a luxury that people in our position cannot afford. Survival requires sacrifice. What have you ever sacrificed?" Abigail sat perfectly still. The vast, echoing dining room suddenly felt terribly claustrophobic. She looked at Margaret. She didn't see an evil monster. She saw a woman who was terrified. Margaret was a prisoner of the very walls she was defending. "I sacrificed my childhood," Abigail said quietly. The room grew so silent that the ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner sounded like hammer blows. "When my father fell ill, I ran the bindery at 16. I fired men twice my age because they tried to steal from us. I went hungry so my father could have medicine. I know exactly what survival costs, Your Grace. But I also know that if you sacrifice your soul to keep a house, you eventually realize you're just living in an empty box." Margaret stared at her. The older woman's jaw tightened, the muscles ticking beneath her powdered skin. She threw her napkin onto the table. "Remove the plates," Margaret ordered the servants, her voice trembling slightly. "I have lost my appetite." She stood up, tall and unyielding. "You will come to my study tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock, Miss Foster, alone." Without waiting for a reply, the Dowager Duchess swept out of the room, leaving the heavy oak doors to swing shut behind her. Henry exhaled a long, ragged breath and rubbed his temples. "I am so sorry, Abby. I knew she would be difficult, but I didn't think—" Abigail reached across the wide table and touched his arm. "She isn't just difficult, Henry. She is defending her life's work. She looks at me and sees the destruction of everything she bled for. She is wrong." "Maybe," Abigail said, pulling her hand back. "But she is a formidable enemy, and I do not think I have won this battle." The Dowager's private study was the only room in Rothmere Abbey that felt truly lived in. It lacked the performative grandeur of the drawing rooms. Instead, it was lined with towering oak bookshelves crammed with ledgers, estate maps, and correspondence. The heavy mahogany desk in the center was scarred from years of use, buried under stacks of parchment. This was the engine room of the dukedom. This was where Margaret Cavendish fought her wars. Abigail arrived precisely at 9 o'clock. She had not slept well. The mattress in her guest room had been stuffed with down, so soft it felt suffocating, and the silence of the countryside was deafening compared to the nocturnal roar of London. Margaret was already at her desk, writing a letter. She did not wear silk this morning, but a severely tailored riding habit of dark grey wool. "Close the door, Miss Foster," Margaret said without looking up. Abigail pushed the heavy oak door shut until the latch clicked. She remained standing until Margaret finally laid down her quill, blotted the ink, and pointed to a leather chair opposite the desk. "Sit." Abigail sat. She folded her hands in her lap, feeling the familiar, rough texture of the small, hidden item she kept in the pocket of her skirt. A habit she had formed whenever she was nervous. Margaret opened a drawer, pulled out a slip of heavy cream paper, and slid it across the polished wood of the desk. Abigail looked down. It was a bank draft drawn on the Bank of England. The payee line was blank. The amount was written in Margaret's sharp, spidery hand, £10,000. Abigail stared at the ink. £10,000! It was a sum so vast it felt entirely abstract. It was enough to buy a grand house in London, to hire servants, to never work another day in her life. It was a lifetime of safety. "This is not cruelty, Miss Foster," Margaret said, leaning back in her chair. "It is mathematics. You are a practical woman. You understand ledgers. You understand deficits. You are a deficit to this family. You bring no dowry, no connections, no political capital. In exchange for your absence, I am offering you absolute security." Abigail did not touch the paper. "You are asking me to sell him." "I am asking you to be realistic," Margaret countered, her tone perfectly level. "Henry is infatuated with your novelty. It will fade. When it does, he will look at you and see the reason his peers whisper behind his back. He will resent you, and you will be trapped in a world that despises you, married to a man who regrets you. Take the money. Go back to London. Start a bindery of your own. live a comfortable, respectable life. Abigail felt a cold, hard knot form in her chest. The logic was venomous because it made sense. Margaret wasn't attacking Abigail's character. She was attacking her reality. "My father once told me," Abigail started, her voice barely a whisper, "that the wealthy only have one tool to fix the world, and it is money. When money fails, they are entirely powerless." Margaret let out a short, harsh laugh. "Your father sounds like a man who never had a sovereign to his name. A comforting philosophy for a failure." Abigail's head snapped up, her eyes flashing. She reached into her pocket. "My father was not a failure," Abigail said, her voice dropping into a register of cold, absolute steel. "He was the best man I ever knew. He worked until his hands bled so I could read. He died of a fever in a freezing room because he gave his last blanket to me." She pulled her hand from her pocket and slammed her fist onto the mahogany desk. When she opened her fingers, a heavy, tarnished object clattered against the wood. "He left me nothing but debt and this," Abigail said. "He told me it was the only thing of true value he had ever owned. He said it was a reminder that honor is a heavy thing to carry, and it usually gets you killed. Keep your money, Your Grace. I am marrying your son." Margaret barely glanced at the object on the desk. She was too busy glaring at Abigail. "You foolish, arrogant girl! You think a trinket and a sob story will—" Margaret's eyes caught the dull gleam of the metal. Her voice stopped. It did not fade. It snapped off entirely like a severed string. The object on the desk was a silver pocket watch, heavily dented, blackened with age and tarnish. But the cover was face up. Engraved into the silver was a crest. Not a simple monogram, but an intricate coat of arms. A falcon clutching a broken sword framed by hawthorn branches. Margaret stopped breathing. The color drained from her face so rapidly that her skin took on the pallor of candle wax. Her eyes widened, dilated with sudden, raw shock. Slowly, with a hand that visibly trembled, the Dowager Duchess reached out and touched the watch. Her fingertips traced the broken sword. "Where?" Margaret's voice was a dry, hollow rasp. She cleared her throat, trying to summon her usual command, but failed. "Where did you get this?" "I just told you," Abigail said, her brow furrowing in confusion at the older woman's sudden physical collapse. "It was my father's, William Foster." "William Foster," Margaret repeated. The name sounded like ash in her mouth. She pressed the release catch on the watch. It popped open. Inside the lid, barely legible, was an inscription. Margaret didn't need to read it. She knew the words by heart. To WB, "My shield, my heart." Margaret closed her eyes. A shudder racked her thin frame. Did he have a burn scar?" "Here." She touched the back of her left hand, her voice barely audible. Abigail froze. The hairs on the back of her neck stood up. "Yes, a terrible one. It extended up to his wrist. He got it in a fire before I was born." "He told you it was a fire?" Margaret whispered, opening her eyes. They were bright with unshed tears, a sight so shocking it left Abigail entirely speechless. "Yes." Abigail leaned forward, suddenly defensive. "How do you know about his scar?" Margaret did not answer. She stared at the tarnished silver watch, her mind fracturing, plunging backward through 3 decades of carefully constructed lies, buried secrets, and repressed grief. William Foster, the bookbinder from Cheapside. He hadn't died in the carriage accident 32 years ago. He hadn't perished after taking the blame for the embezzlement that would have sent Margaret's own brother to the gallows. Lord William Beaufort, the second son of the Duke of Clarrington, the only man Margaret had ever truly, desperately loved, had simply vanished into the slums of London. He had abandoned his title, his family, and his fortune, taking Margaret's shame upon his own shoulders so she could marry the Duke of Rothermere with a spotless reputation. He had lived in poverty. He had died in a freezing room. And the girl sitting across from her, the girl Margaret had just spent 24 hours trying to humiliate, degrade, and bribe, was William's daughter. Margaret slowly looked up at Abigail. The fierce, terrifying Dowager Duchess was gone. In her place sat a hollow, devastated woman, staring at the living ghost of her greatest sin. Margaret Cavendish did not weep. Women of her station were taught that tears were a weapon of the weak, a currency spent by those who had nothing else to bargain with. But as her fingers lingered over the dented silver watch, a fractured, terrible sound escaped her throat. It was a gasp of pure, unfiltered agony. Abigail watched her, the anger in her chest suddenly faltering. She had expected rage. She had expected the Dowager to throw the watch across the room and summon the footman. She had not expected this absolute, crumbling devastation. "You did not answer my question," Abigail said. Her voice was firm, but her hands were cold. "How do you know about my father's scar?" Margaret slowly withdrew her hand from the watch. She looked at the £10,000 bank draft sitting on the desk. Suddenly, the sum looked pathetic. It looked like an insult. She reached out, picked up the slip of paper, and tore it in half. Then she tore it again. "He told you it was a fire," Margaret murmured, speaking more to the ghosts in the room than to the girl sitting across from her. Of course he did. William never could bear to burden anyone with the truth. He carried everyone else's sins and called them his own. "What are you talking about?" Abigail demanded, leaning forward. "My father was a bookbinder. He lived in Cheapside. He died there." "Your father was Lord William Beaufort," Margaret said. Her voice was perfectly flat, completely devoid of its usual aristocratic cadence. "He was the second son of the Duke of Clarendon. He grew up in a house twice the size of this one. And he did not get that scar in a fire, Miss Foster. He got it pulling my brother from a wrecked carriage before it plunged into a ravine. A carriage my brother was driving while entirely intoxicated, fleeing the continent with £20,000 of stolen Crown funds." Abigail sat back. The leather chair creaked beneath her. She felt as though the floorboards had suddenly vanished. No, that is impossible. You are lying. You are trying to confuse me." Margaret's slate eyes finally met Abigail's. There was no deception in them. There was only ruin. 32 years ago?" Margaret continued, the words spilling out like blood from a reopened wound. "My brother was facing the gallows for treason and embezzlement. My family was ruined. My engagement to the Duke of Rothmere was on the verge of collapse. We were about to lose everything. Our lands, our name, our lives." Margaret paused, her hands gripping the edge of the mahogany desk so tightly her knuckles turned bone white. "William loved me. We were young, and we were foolish, and he loved me with a ferocity that terrified me. When he found out what my brother had done, he did not hesitate. He took the stolen ledger. He forged his own name over my brother's. And then he vanished. The authorities found his horse by the river. They found his coat. They assumed he had drowned trying to escape the magistrate." Abigail could not breathe. The walls of the study seemed to tilt inward. She thought of her father's hands, the deep calluses, the ink stains that never washed out. She thought of the winters they spent huddled by a meagre coal fire, wrapped in thin blankets, reading battered copies of Shakespeare because they could not afford a hot meal. "He gave up his name," Margaret whispered. "He let the world believe he was a thief and a coward, so that my family's name would remain untouched, so that I could marry a duke. I spent 3 decades believing he was dead at the bottom of the Thames." Margaret looked at Abigail, really looked at her, seeing the shape of William's jaw, the stubborn set of his shoulders. "He didn't drown," Margaret said, her voice cracking. "He went to Cheapside. He learned a trade. He bled, and he starved, and he died in a freezing room. Because of me." Abigail stood up. Her legs felt hollow, like dry reeds. She looked down at the woman who had tormented her at dinner, the woman wrapped in velvet and power. The power was a lie. The velvet was bought with her father's life. "You," Abigail breathed, the word trembling with a fury so profound it tasted like copper in her mouth. "You sat at that dining table. You mocked his trade. You mocked the poverty he endured to keep you in diamonds. I didn't know, Margaret pleaded, a desperate, hollow defense. Miss Foster, I swear to you on my life, I didn't know. Does it matter? Abigail shouted. The sound shattered the oppressive quiet of the study. Does it matter if you knew his name? You sat there and told me that survival requires sacrifice. You asked me what I had ever sacrificed. My entire life was a sacrifice to your comfort. She reached across the desk and snatched the pocket watch. The silver was warm now, heated by Margaret's touch. He never spoke of you, Abigail said viciously, wanting to hurt the dowager, wanting to inflict even a fraction of the pain her father had suffered. He never mentioned your name. He died with nothing, but he died with a clear conscience. You have everything, Your Grace, and you are rotting from the inside out. Abigail turned on her heel and walked toward the door. The heavy oak door swung open before Abigail could reach the brass handle. Henry stood in the threshold. He wore his riding boots and a tense, battle-ready expression. He had come to rescue his bride from his mother's claws. He took one look at Abigail's pale, furious face, and then looked past her to the desk. His mother was slumped in her chair, her face buried in her hands. She looked small. It was a physical impossibility in Henry's mind. His mother did not look small. She was an institution. Abby, Henry asked, reaching for her arm. What happened? What did she say to you? Abigail pulled away from his touch. It wasn't intentional, but his hand felt like the wealth that had killed her father. It felt heavy and suffocating. Ask her, Abigail said, her voice jagged. Henry stepped fully into the room, closing the door behind him. He looked at the torn pieces of the bank draft scattered across the desk. His jaw set into a hard line. You tried to pay her off. After I explicitly told you not to interfere, you tried to buy her. Margaret lowered her hands. She looked up at her son. Her eyes were red-rimmed, the severe, flawless mask of the Dowager Duchess completely shattered. I did, Margaret said. Her voice was raspy, exhausted, and she refused. Because she is not something you can purchase. Henry snapped, stepping closer to the desk. I am marrying her, mother, and if you cannot accept that, we will leave Rothmere today. We will marry in London and you will not be invited. Henry! Margaret's voice was barely a whisper. You do not understand. I understand perfectly. You care more about bloodlines than you do about my happiness. Her bloodline is older than yours, Margaret said. The statement hit the room like a physical blow. Henry stopped moving. He stared at his mother, the anger momentarily derailed by sheer confusion. What? Margaret pointed a trembling finger at the pocket watch tightly clutched in Abigail's fist. Her father was Lord William Beaufort. He was the man who took the fall for your uncle's treason. He was the man who saved this family from absolute ruin. Henry turned slowly to look at Abigail. Beaufort? The Clarrington family? Abby, why didn't you tell me? Because I didn't know! Abigail yelled, the tears finally spilling over her lashes, hot and angry. He was William Foster to me. He was a man who worked until his fingers were stained black. He was a man who couldn't afford medicine when his lungs failed. He wasn't a lord, he was a bookbinder. She turned on Henry, the grief turning into a wild, cornered animal. And do you know why he was a bookbinder, Henry? Do you know why I grew up with nothing? Because he took the blame for her family's crimes, so she could marry your father, so you could be born a duke and live in this massive, empty castle. Henry looked as though the air had been violently punched from his lungs. He looked at Abigail, and then at his mother. The reality of his entire existence was shifting, rearranging itself into a grotesque new shape. His title, his estates, his pristine reputation, they were not a divine right. They were a purchase, and the price had been paid in full by the shivering, dying man in a cheapside attic. Mother, Henry said, his voice dropping an octave, filled with a horrified realization. "Is this true?" Margaret closed her eyes and nodded once. Henry stepped back. He looked around the opulent study, at the towering ledgers, the silver inkwells, the velvet curtains. Suddenly it all looked filthy. The immaculate legacy of the Cavendish family was built on a foundation of stolen honor. "You let him do it!" Henry accused, his voice thick with disgust. "I was 20 years old!" Margaret cried out, the defensive instinct finally flaring up. "I was terrified. He forged the papers before I even knew what he was planning, and once it was done, the Crown was satisfied. If I had spoken up, my brother would have hanged. William would have hanged for aiding him. I made the only choice I could make to keep my family alive. And you let his family die," Henry said brutally. Margaret flinched as if struck. Henry turned back to Abigail. He reached out again, slower this time. "Abby, please." Abigail shook her head. The anger was fading, leaving behind an exhausting, hollow ache. She looked at the two of them, a duke and a duchess, trapped in a gilded cage of their own making, suddenly choking on the truth. "I need to be alone," Abigail whispered. She didn't wait for permission. She walked out of the study, leaving the door wide open. She walked down the long, echoing corridors of Rothmere Abbey, the portraits of dead, arrogant men staring down at her. She realized, with a strange, bitter clarity, that she finally belonged in this house. She had paid the admission price with her father's life. It was 3 a.m. The abbey was completely silent, save for the wind howling against the limestone walls and the occasional creak of settling timber. Abigail had not slept. She had sat by the window in her guest room, watching the frost creep across the glass panes in intricate, jagged patterns. Her mind spun in an endless, agonizing loop. Lord William Beaufort. How could the man who had taught her to sew bookbindings have been born to silk? How could he have kept such a monumental secret? And more importantly, how could she marry into the family that had destroyed him? Unable to bear the confines of her room, Abigail wrapped a wool shawl around her shoulders and stepped out into the dark hallway. She walked aimlessly, letting the sprawling, labyrinthine architecture of the abbey swallow her. She eventually found herself in the long portrait gallery on the first floor. Moonlight spilled through the tall, arched windows, casting pale, rectangular pools across the polished floorboards. She was not alone. Sitting on a velvet bench beneath a towering portrait of the 3rd Duke of Rothmere was Margaret. The Dowager Duchess was not wearing her corset. She wore a simple, unadorned dressing gown of dark wool. Her silver hair, usually pinned with structural perfection, hung loose in a single braid down her back. She held a crystal glass in her hand, the amber liquid inside catching the moonlight. Beside her on the bench sat a half-empty decanter of brandy. Abigail stopped at the entrance of the gallery. She considered turning around, but the exhaustion in her bones demanded a resolution, or at least an end to the running. She walked forward. Margaret did not look surprised to see her. She merely slid over slightly on the bench, making room. It was a tiny gesture, but in the rigid world of Margaret Cavendish, it was a profound surrender of territory. Abigail sat. They remained in silence for a long time. The only sound was the distant wind and the soft clink of ice against crystal as Margaret took a sip of her drink. "You look like him," Margaret said softly, staring straight ahead at the opposite wall. Abigail tightened her shawl. "My father had brown eyes. Yours are slate." "I meant in your carriage," Margaret clarified. "The way you hold your shoulders, as if you are waiting for the roof to cave in, but fully prepared to hold it up when it does. William had that posture." "He had to," Abigail said bitterly. "He spent his life holding up the ruins of your mistakes." Margaret took another slow sip of brandy. She did not flinch at the accusation. She accepted it with the grim resignation of a woman finally receiving a long-delayed sentence. "I loved him," Margaret said. The words sounded strange in the vast, cold gallery. "I know that sounds like a lie to you. I know it sounds like an excuse. It isn't. I loved him more than my own life, but I loved my family's survival more." She turned her head to look at Abigail. The moonlight caught the deep lines around her mouth, exposing her age, her weariness. "You told me this afternoon that survival requires sacrifice, and you asked me what I had sacrificed," Margaret said, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "I sacrificed him, and I have spent 32 years punishing myself for it. I married a man I did not love. I rebuilt an estate that was collapsing under debt. I turned my heart into stone because if I had allowed myself to feel anything, the guilt would have driven me mad. I became a monster, Miss Foster, to ensure that William's sacrifice wasn't wasted." Abigail looked at the older woman. The hatred she had felt just hours ago was struggling to maintain its shape. It is very difficult to hate someone who is entirely shattered. "You thought you were protecting Henry by sending me away," Abigail realized quietly. "You saw a commoner, and you thought history was repeating itself. You thought Henry was making a foolish, romantic mistake that would destroy the estate, just like your brother did. I saw a girl who did not belong in a cage." Margaret corrected. She set the crystal glass down on the bench. "I looked at you, and I saw a woman with calloused hands and a spine made of iron. I knew society would try to break you, and I knew Henry, for all his good intentions, would not be able to stop them. The House of Lords does not fight with swords, Miss Foster. They fight with whispers. They fight with exclusion. They would have bled you dry. So you decided to bleed me first," Abigail said flatly. "I decided to test you," Margaret admitted. "And then I tried to buy you. I wanted to see if your love for him was stronger than your desire for safety." Margaret let out a short, hollow laugh. "And then you threw his watch on my desk, and I realized that I am not the one who needs to protect Henry from you. Henry needs to be protected from me, from the rot I allowed into this family." Abigail looked down at her hands in her lap. "Henry said he would leave. He said we would marry in London, and he would leave the estate." "He will do no such thing," Margaret said sharply, a flash of the old dowager returning. "Henry is the Duke of Rothmere. This estate is his duty. He cannot abandon it, and you will not let him." "Why shouldn't I?" Abigail asked, turning to face her. "Why shouldn't we leave? This place was built on my father's blood." "Because," Margaret said, leaning closer, her eyes burning with sudden, fierce intensity. "Because your father paid for this estate. He bought it with his life, which means it does not belong to Henry. It does not belong to me." Margaret reached out. Her hand hovered in the space between them for a second, before she gently placed her cold, aristocratic fingers over Abigail's rough, ink-stained knuckles. "It belongs to you," Margaret whispered. "It always has." Abigail stared at the woman's hand. The Dowager Duchess of Rothmere was kneeling, metaphorically, at the feet of a Cheapside bookbinder's daughter. "You are going to marry my son," Margaret commanded, though her voice shook. "You are going to take my title. You are going to sit at the head of that table, and you are going to rule this family, and I will stand behind you. I will teach you every ledger. I will show you every political alliance. I will introduce you to every viper in London, and I will show you how to cut off their heads before they can strike." A tear finally escaped Margaret's eye, tracing a silver line down her powdered cheek. "I owe William a debt I cannot pay," she said, her voice breaking. "But I can pay you. I can give you the world he was forced to surrender. Let me do this, Abigail, please. Let me give you his kingdom." Abigail looked at the dark gallery, at the shadows and the velvet and the cold marble. It was not the life she had wanted, but as she felt Margaret's trembling hand over hers, she realized it was a life she could forge into something new. She was a binder. She knew how to stitch broken pages back together. "Tomorrow," Abigail said quietly. "You will show me the estate ledgers." Margaret let out a breath that sounded like a sob. She squeezed Abigail's hand. "Tomorrow." The transition of power did not happen with a grand ceremony. It happened on a Tuesday, over a pile of cracked leather ledgers. At exactly 9 o'clock, Abigail walked into the dowager's study. The morning light was brutal and grey, slicing through the tall windows and illuminating the dust motes dancing over the mahogany desk. Margaret was already there. She did not offer tea. She pushed a stack of bound accounts across the wood. "The Rothmere estate is not a home," Margaret said, her voice stripped of its usual aristocratic cadence. It was the voice of a quartermaster preparing for a siege. "It is an industry. We employ 800 people directly. We house 3,000 indirectly. If a harvest fails in the northern tenant farms, 50 families starve. If we default on our loans to the Bank of England, this entire valley collapses." Abigail sat. She pulled the top ledger toward her, the familiar smell of dried ink and aged vellum instantly grounding her. She opened the cover. Rows of numbers, tight and precise, marched across the pages. "Henry's father was a fool," Margaret continued flatly. "He liked horses, cards, and men who flattered him. When I married him, the estate was £40,000 in debt. I spent 10 years liquidating assets, firing useless retainers, and negotiating grain prices to pull us back from the brink of ruin." Abigail ran her finger down a column of expenses. Her eyes, trained for years to spot discrepancies in her father's meagre accounts, quickly adjusted to the scale. The numbers were larger, but the math was exactly the same. "You are overpaying for your coal," Abigail said quietly. Margaret paused. She looked at the page. "We buy from the Staffordshire mines. We have used them for 20 years, and they are charging you a premium for the loyalty." Abigail countered, tapping the paper. "Look at the shipping tariffs. They are passing the canal tolls on to you on top of a base price that is 6 pence higher per ton than the London market rate. You are paying for their transportation overhead." Margaret walked around the desk, leaning over Abigail's shoulder to look at the numbers. The proximity was startling. A day ago, Margaret would not have shared the same breathing air with Abigail if she could help it. Now she stared at the ledger, her brow furrowing. "Can you prove that?" Margaret asked. "I bought coal to keep my father from freezing." Abigail said, the memory devoid of self-pity, entirely practical. "I know what a ton of raw anthracite costs. I know what the bargemen charge. Write to a broker in Newcastle. Tell them you are ending the Staffordshire contract unless they undercut this price by 15%. They will do it." Margaret stood up slowly. She looked at Abigail, a strange mixture of resentment and profound, terrifying respect settling in her slate eyes. "You are a ruthless girl," Margaret murmured. "I am a poor girl," Abigail corrected. "The rich can afford to overpay. The poor learn the exact value of a penny because the lack of it means you go hungry." The door opened. Henry stepped inside. He wore a heavy wool riding coat, his face flushed from the cold. He stopped abruptly, staring at the scene before him. His mother, the Dowager Duchess of Rothmere, and his fiancé, the bookbinder from Cheapside, were huddled over the estate ledgers like two generals mapping a battlefield. "Am I interrupting?" Henry asked cautiously. Margaret looked at her son. For the first time in Henry's life, he saw something in his mother's eyes that looked entirely unfamiliar. It wasn't maternal warmth, and it wasn't commanding authority. It was relief. "No, Henry," Margaret said, stepping back from the desk. "We were just discussing the coal contracts. Abigail is going to restructure them." Henry blinked. "Restructure them? Mother, you have handled the accounts for 30 years, and I am tired," Margaret said. The admission was so quiet it barely disturbed the air, but to Henry, it sounded like a cannon firing. "Miss Foster has a better grasp of the commodity markets than our solicitor. Let her work." Henry looked at Abigail. She did not offer him a reassuring smile. She merely dipped a quill into the inkwell and turned the page. He realized, with a sudden sharp clarity, that he was no longer the sole anchor keeping Abigail in this world. She had found her own footing. Over the next 3 weeks, the study became their sanctuary and their war room. They did not speak of William Beaufort again. The grief was too massive, too radioactive to touch. Instead, they channeled it into the mechanics of survival. Margaret taught Abigail the intricate, venomous web of society politics, which dukes held grudges, which countesses controlled the social seasons, which bankers were vulnerable to pressure. In return, Abigail stripped away the inefficiencies of the estate with a surgeon's precision. She cut bloated budgets. She redirected funds from ornamental gardens to repairing the roofs of the tenant cottages, arguing coldly that sick workers harvested less wheat. She was taking the empire Margaret had preserved and turning it into something terrifyingly efficient. She was building a fortress, and she was doing it in her father's name. The true test did not come in the quiet of the Abbey's study. It came in late November, 2 weeks before the wedding, at the Duke of Somerset's annual winter ball in London. It was Abigail's introduction to the ton. The ballroom was a cavern of gold leaf, mirrored walls, and thousands of dripping wax candles. The heat generated by 500 bodies packed into the space was stifling, thick with the scent of expensive French perfumes and nervous sweat. Abigail stood at the edge of the dance floor. She wore a gown of deep emerald silk, completely devoid of lace or ruffles. The cut was severe, tailored perfectly to her frame. At her throat rested a simple, devastatingly expensive diamond collar. Margaret had personally fastened it around her neck before they left the townhouse. Armor, the dowager had called it. Henry stood beside her, his hand resting lightly on the small of her back. He was tense. He could feel the stares. They prickled against his skin. Every aristocrat in the room was looking at the woman who had somehow bypassed the impenetrable walls of the Rothmere bloodline. They are staring, Henry muttered, his jaw tight. Let them stare, Abigail said evenly. She did not look down. She kept her chin parallel to the floor, her eyes sweeping the room with a cold, analytical detachment. She did not see lords and ladies. She saw the names from Margaret's ledgers. She saw debts, alliances, and vulnerabilities. A ripple moved through the crowd as a woman separated herself from the throng and glided toward them. She wore pale pink satin that looked entirely too young for her sharp, hawkish features. It was Lady Stanhope. She was a woman whose social power was derived entirely from her ability to destroy reputations with a single, well-placed whisper. "Your Grace," Lady Stanhope purred, dipping into a shallow curtsy before Henry. Then she turned her pale eyes on Abigail. The smile on her face was thin, brittle, and utterly devoid of warmth. "And this must be the infamous Miss Foster. We have heard so much about you in London, a veritable fairy tale." "Lady Stanhope," Abigail said. Her voice was steady, perfectly modulated. "I must confess I am fascinated," the older woman continued, snapping her fan open. "A bookbinder, I understand? How terribly quaint. Tell me, Miss Foster, do you actually read the books, or simply glue the leather together? It must be so difficult adjusting to a world where the words inside matter more than the covers." Henry stiffened, stepping forward. "Lady Stanhope, you overstep." Abigail raised a gloved hand, gently but firmly stopping Henry. She did not break eye contact with Lady Stanhope. Out of the corner of her eye, Abigail saw Margaret approaching through the crowd. The Dowager Duchess was a terrifying sight in full evening dress, her slate eyes locked onto Lady Stanhope like a falcon spotting a field mouse. But Abigail gave Margaret a microscopic shake of her head. "I will handle this." Abigail took a slow, deliberate half-step forward, invading Lady Stanhope's personal space. "I read quite a bit, Lady Stanhope," Abigail said. Her voice was quiet, forcing the older woman to lean in slightly to hear her over the string quartet. Particularly non-fiction, mathematics, accounts, I find the absolute truth of numbers far more compelling than fiction. Lady Stanhope's smile faltered slightly. Indeed? Indeed! Abigail said. For instance, I was reading a fascinating ledger just last Tuesday. It detailed the agricultural loans extended by the Rothmere estate over the past 5 years. The colour began to drain from Lady Stanhope's cheeks. Abigail let the silence stretch for a long, agonizing second. It is remarkable how many prominent families rely on a quiet, extended line of credit to maintain their appearances. Your husband's estates in Yorkshire, for example. The drought last summer must have been devastating. A deficit of nearly £8,000, if my memory serves. Lady Stanhope snapped her fan shut. Her knuckles were white. I learned in the bindery. Abigail continued, her voice soft, almost conversational, that if you pull a single loose thread, the entire spine of the book can collapse. I imagine the same is true of a family's finances. If a creditor were to call in those debts suddenly, the resulting collapse would be quite public. And very ugly. Lady Stanhope opened her mouth, but no sound came out. She looked at the young woman in the emerald silk, expecting to see a frightened commoner. Instead, she saw a predator. But as you said, Abigail finished, offering a smile that was a terrifying mirror of Margaret's. I am new to this world. I am still learning how things work. Enjoy the champagne, Lady Stanhope. Abigail turned smoothly away, slipping her hand back into Henry's arm. Lady Stanhope stood frozen for a moment, before turning and practically fleeing into the crowd. Henry stared at Abigail, his mouth slightly parted. Abby, did you just threaten the Earl of Stanhope's wife with financial ruin? I merely discussed literature, Abigail replied. From a few feet away, Margaret watched the exchange. She took a slow sip of her champagne. For the first time in 32 years, the crushing weight in the dowager's chest eased. The dukedom was safe. William's daughter did not need to be protected from the wolves of society. She was going to command the pack. The wedding took place in the second week of December. It was not held in London. Margaret, in a final display of her absolute power over the ton, had decreed that the ceremony would take place in the ancient stone chapel on the grounds of Rothmere Abbey. If the lords and ladies of society wished to witness the event, they would have to endure a punishing carriage ride through the winter frost to get there. Most of them did. Fear of Margaret Cavendish's displeasure was a far stronger motivator than convenience. The morning of the wedding, the air was bitterly cold. The sky was a pale, bruised purple, heavy with the promise of snow. Abigail stood in the center of her bedchamber. 3 maids hovered around her, making final adjustments to her gown. It was not white. It was a deep, rich ivory silk, heavily embroidered with silver thread along the hem. It was a gown fit for a queen, heavy and substantial. The door opened, and Margaret walked in. She carried a small, flat mahogany box. She dismissed the maids with a single flick of her wrist. The women curtsied and scurried from the room, pulling the heavy door shut behind them. The 2 women looked at each other in the quiet room. Margaret approached. She opened the box. Resting on a bed of dark blue velvet was the tarnished silver pocket watch. But it had been altered. The heavy chain had been removed, replaced with a delicate, intricately woven ribbon of silver wire, designed to be pinned to the bodice of a dress. Abigail reached out and touched the cool metal. I had the jeweller in London set it, Margaret said quietly. He polished the worst of the tarnish away, but I told him to leave the dents. It felt wrong to erase the damage. It is beautiful, Abigail whispered. Margaret lifted the watch and carefully pinned it to the ivory silk, just above Abigail's heart. The Beaufort crest, the falcon and the broken sword gleamed in the muted winter light. When you walk down that aisle, Margaret said, her voice thick with emotion she refused to let spill over, you are not walking alone. You carry him with you. You carry the blood of the Clarrington dukes and the grit of the Cheapside streets. Let them look at you, Abigail. Let them see exactly what it costs to stand where you stand." Abigail looked at the older woman. The bitter, cynical hatred that had defined their first meeting was gone, burned away in the crucible of truth. What remained was a profound, complicated alliance. They were bound together by the ghost of a man who had loved one of them and fathered the other. "What will you do now?" Abigail asked. "I will retire to the Dower House," Margaret replied. "I have fought for 30 years. I am laying down my sword. I may still need you." Margaret smiled. It was a genuine, tired smile. "No, you won't, but I will be there nonetheless." An hour later, Abigail stood at the heavy oak doors of the chapel. The air inside smelled of burning pine, cold stone, and hundreds of expensive perfumes. When the doors swung open, the silence was absolute. Abigail stepped forward. She did not look at the pews lined with the most powerful men and women in England. She did not look at the gold-leafed altar. She looked only at the end of the aisle. Henry waited for her. He looked terrified and fiercely proud all at once. As Abigail walked, the heavy ivory silk dragging against the stone floor, she felt the weight of the silver watch against her chest. She thought of her father's ink-stained hands. She thought of the freezing attic, the smell of boiling glue, the relentless, grinding poverty. "Honor is a heavy thing to carry, Abby." She reached the altar. Henry took her hand. His skin was warm. The bishop began to speak, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings. The words of the ceremony washed over her, ancient and binding. But Abigail wasn't listening to the bishop. She was looking at Henry and past him, to the dark, towering walls of Rothmere Abbey. This was not a fairy tale ending. Fairy tales were for children who believed that castles were built by magic, not by blood, sweat, and crushing debt. This was a conquest. She was a working-class girl who had walked into the jaws of the most ruthless aristocracy on earth and broken its teeth. When Henry placed the heavy gold ring on her finger, she did not tremble. "With this ring I thee wed," Henry murmured, his eyes locked onto hers. "I, Abigail, take thee, Henry," she replied, her voice ringing clear and steady in the silent chapel. She was no longer a victim of the aristocracy's collateral damage. She was the architect of its future. The Dowager Duchess had surrendered her throne, and the bookbinder's daughter had taken it. The bishop pronounced them man and wife. As they turned to face the congregation, Henry offered his arm. Abigail took it. She looked out over the sea of powdered faces, silk and diamonds. They bowed their heads as the new Duke and Duchess of Rothmere began their walk down the aisle. Abigail Foster touched the silver watch at her breast. She lifted her chin, feeling the brutal, magnificent weight of the crown settle upon her shoulders. She was ready for the war. If you found yourself holding your breath as Abigail took down society's most vicious vipers, hit that like button right now. Stories of resilience, revenge, and reclaiming stolen power are what we live for here. Don't forget to share this video with someone who loves a deeply grounded historical drama, and hit subscribe to join our community for more intense, unpolished storytelling. What was your favorite moment of Abigail's revenge? Did the Dowager Duchess redeem herself, or is she beyond forgiveness? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. I read every single one. See you in the next story.